Today, the pathway to net zero. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to the latest post covering finance and problem news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Well, the world has a viable pathway to building a global energy sector with net zero emissions in 2050, but it's narrow and requires an unprecedented transformation of how energy is produced, transported and used globally, according to the International Energy Agency in its landmark special report recently released. Climate pledges by governments to date, even if fully achieved, would fall short of what's required to bring global energy-related carbon dioxide emissions to net zero by 2050 and give the world an even chance of limiting the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees centigrade, according to the report called Net Zero by 2050, a roadmap for the global energy sector. The report, they say, is the world's first comprehensive study of how to transition to a net zero energy system by 2050 while ensuring stable and affordable energy supplies, providing universal energy access and enabling robust economic growth. It sets out a cost-effective and economically productive pathway resulting in a clean, dynamic and resilient energy economy dominated by renewables like solar and wind instead of fossil fuels. The report also examines key uncertainties such as the roles of bioenergy, carbon capture and behavioural changes in reaching net zero. Our roadmap, they say, shows the priority actions that are needed today to ensure the opportunity of net zero emissions by 2050, narrow but still achievable, is not lost. The scale and speed of the efforts demanded by this critical and formidable goal, our best chance of tackling climate change and limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade, makes this perhaps the greatest challenge humankind has ever faced, said Fatih Birol, the IEA Executive Director. The IEA's pathway to this brighter future brings a historic surge in clean energy investment that creates millions of new jobs and lifts global economic growth. Moving the world onto that pathway requires strong and credible policy actions from governments, underpinned by much greater international cooperation. Building on the IEA's unrivaled energy modelling tools and expertise, the roadmap sets out more than 400 milestones to guide the global journey to net zero by 2050. These include, from today, no investment in new fossil fuel supply projects and no further final investment decisions for new unabated coal plants. By 2035, there are no sales of new internal combustion engine passenger cars, and by 2040, the global electricity sector has already reached net zero emissions. In the near term, they say, the report describes a net zero pathway that requires the immediate and massive deployment of all available clean and efficient energy technologies, combined with a major global push to accelerate innovation. The pathway calls for annual additions of solar PV to reach 630 gigawatts by 2030, and those of wind power to reach 290 gigawatts. Together, this is 4 times the record set in 2020. For solar PV, it's equivalent to installing the world's current largest solar park roughly every day. A major worldwide push to increase energy efficiency is also an essential part of those efforts, resulting in the global rate of energy efficiency improvements averaging 4% a year through to 2030, about 3 times the average over the last 2 decades. Most of the global reductions in CO2 emissions between now and 2030 in the net zero pathway comes from technologies readily available today. But in 2050, almost half the reductions come from technologies that are currently only at the demonstration or prototype phase. This demands that governments quickly increase and reprioritise their spending on research and development, as well as on demonstrating and deploying clean energy technologies, putting them at the core of energy and climate policy. Progress in the areas of advanced batteries, electrolysis for hydrogen and direct air capture and storage can be particularly impactful. A transition of such scale and speed cannot be achieved without sustained support and participation from citizens whose lives will be affected in multiple ways. The clean energy transition is for and about people, Dr. Burrell said. Our roadmap shows that the enormous challenge of rapidly transitioning to a net zero energy system is also a huge opportunity for our economies. The transition must be fair and inclusive, leaving no one behind. We have to ensure that developing economies receive the financing and technology know-how they need to build out their energy systems to meet the needs of their expanding populations and economies in a sustainable way. Providing electricity to around 785 million people who have no access to it and clean cooking solutions to 2.6 billion people who lack them is an integrated part of the roadmap's net zero pathway. This costs around $40 billion a year, equal to about 1% of average annual energy sector investment. It also brings major health benefits through reductions in indoor air pollution, cutting the number of premature deaths by 2.5 million a year, and total annual energy investment surges to $5 trillion by 2030 in the net zero pathway, adding an extra 0.4 percentage points a year to global GDP growth, based on a joint analysis with the IMF. The jump in private and government spending creates millions of jobs in clean energy, including energy efficiency, as well as in the engineering, manufacturing and construction industries. All of this puts global GDP 4% higher in 2030 than it would reach based on current trends. And by 2050, the energy world looks completely different. Global energy demand is around 8% smaller than today, but it serves an economy more than twice as big and a population with 2 billion more people. Almost 90% of electricity generation comes from renewable sources, with wind and solar PV together accounting for around 70%. Most of the remainder comes from nuclear power. Solar is the world's single largest source of total energy supply. Fossil fuels fall from almost 4/5 of total energy supply today to slightly over 1/5. And fossil fuels that remain are used in goods where the carbon is embodied in the products, such as plastics, in facilities fitted with carbon capture, and in sectors where low emissions technology options are scarce. The pathway laid out in our roadmap is global in scope, but each country will need to design its own strategy, taking into account its own specific circumstances, said Dr. Burrell. Plans need to reflect countries' different stages of economic development. In our pathway, advanced economies reach total net zero before developing countries. The IEA stands ready to support governments in preparing their own national and regional roadmaps, to provide guidance and assistance in implementing them, and to promote international cooperation on accelerating the energy transition worldwide. The special report is designed to inform the high-level negotiations that will take place at the 26th Conference of the Parties, the COP26 Conference of the United Nations Climate Change Framework Convention in Glasgow in November. And it was requested as part of the input to the negotiations by the UK's government COP26 presidency. I welcome this report, which sets out a clear roadmap to net zero emissions and shares many of the priorities we have set as the incoming COP presidency, that we must act now to scale up clean technologies in all sectors and phase out both coal power and polluting vehicles in the coming decade, says COP26 President-designate Anok Sharma. I am encouraged that it underlines the great value of international collaboration, without which the transition to global net zero could be delayed by decades. Our first goal for the UK as COP26 presidency is to put the world on a path to driving down emissions until they reach net zero by the middle of the century. New energy security challenges will emerge on the way to net zero by 2050, while long-standing ones will remain even as the role of oil and gas diminishes. The contraction of oil and natural gas production will have far-reaching implications for all the countries and companies that produce those fuels. No new oil and natural gas fields are needed in the net zero pathway, and suppliers become increasingly concentrated in a small number of low-cost producers. OPEC's share of much reduced global oil supply grows from around 37% in the recent years to 52% in 2050, a level higher than at any point in the history of the oil markets, and growing energy security challenges that result from the increasing importance of electricity include the viability of supply from some renewables and cybersecurity risks. In addition, the rising dependence on critical minerals required for key clean energy technologies and infrastructure brings risks of price volatility and supply disruptions that could hinder the transition. Since the IEA's founding in 1974, one of its core missions has been to promote secure and affordable energy supplies to foster economic growth. This has remained a key concern of our net zero roadmap, Dr. Burrell said. Governments need to create markets for investments in batteries, digital solutions, and electricity grids that reward flexibility and enable adequate and reliable supplies of electricity. The rapidly growing role of critical minerals calls for new international mechanisms to ensure both the timely availability of supplies and sustainable production. The full report is available for free on the IEA's website, along with an online interactive that highlights some of the key milestones in the pathway that must be achieved in the next 3 decades to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And this from The Conversation: even if every country meets its current climate targets, Earth's temperatures will still rise by a dangerous 2.1 degrees this century, according to sobering findings from the new International Energy Agency report. The IEA found the route to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 was narrow and extremely challenging, and electricity grids in developed economies such as Australia's must be zero emissioned by 2053. The IEA was abundantly clear: no new fossil fuel projects should be approved. The report, they say, couldn't come at a worse time for the Morrison government. This week, it's announced $600 million for a major new gas-fired power plant at Kurri in New South Wales, claiming it was needed to shore up electricity supplies. The IEA's findings cast serious doubts on this decision and puts even more pressure on Australia ahead of crucial international climate talks in Glasgow in November. So let's take a look at the report in more detail and see how Australia measures up. The IEA report sets out a comprehensive roadmap to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. The good news is it's still achievable, but it will take a lot of money and enormous effort. There must be what the report describes as a total transformation of the energy systems that underpin our economies. Put simply, the world's energy economy must be grounded in solar and wind, not coal, gas and oil. The report works from a basic principle: even if the climate pledges countries have already made under the Paris Agreement are all fully achieved, there will still be 22 billion tonnes of global carbon dioxide emissions in 2050. So the IEA set out more than 400 milestones to achieve the global energy transformation, and these absolutely must be complied with if we're to stop catastrophic global warming and limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees centigrade. Enormous amounts of money are needed to shift away from fossil fuels and meet the global energy demand doubling over the next 30 years. Existing networks took 130 years to build. We need to build the same again in about 1/6 of the time. This includes investing in hydrogen and bioenergy, which is energy made from organic material, which the report calls a pillar of decarbonisation. Electric vehicles need to be rapidly expanded to 65% of the global fleet by 2030 and 100% by 2050. This will require an enormous increase in public electric vehicle charging units and hydrogen refuelling units. To facilitate the shift, petrol and diesel will be phased out. Many countries around the world, including the United Kingdom and Japan, have already introduced a ban on new fossil fuel cars by 2030. We need to urgently retrofit homes and buildings to make them more energy efficient. Steel, cement and chemical industries, primary emitters, must shift to carbon capture and sequestration and hydrogen. But the biggest take-home message for Australia is that there must be no new development in fossil fuel beyond 2021. The report states, beyond projects already committed as of 2021, there are no new oil and gas fields approved for development in our pathway, and no new coal mines or mine extensions are required. Global demand for oil peaked in 2019 and has declined since then, largely due to COVID-19 lockdowns. Under the roadmap, this decline will continue and reach 75% by 2050. Any growth in demand during this period will be met by growing emergent markets in renewables, green hydrogen, and bioenergy. And of course, the report states no new coal plant should be financially supported unless equipped with carbon capture and sequestration. Inefficient coal plants must be phased out by 2030. If the roadmap is followed, renewable energy will overtake coal by 2026 and oil and gas by 2030. For this to happen, annual additions of 630 gigawatts of solar and 390 gigawatts of wind power will be required by 2030. And this means the world needs to install the equivalent of the world's largest solar park roughly every day, according to the report. Australia's gas-fired recovery plans are directly inconsistent with the IEA roadmap. The government has argued expanding fossil fuel supply is critical for energy security. Not only did the federal government just announce over $500 million for a new gas-fired power plant in New South Wales, it's also spending a further $173 million to develop the Beetaloo Basin in the Northern Territory, another gas reserve. Experts, advisors and Energy Security Board Chair Kerry Schott have all disagreed with these moves. They argue, in line with the IEA report, that cheaper, cleaner alternatives to gas generation, such as wind and solar, can easily provide the dispatchable power required. The government's stubborn fossil fuel funding will make it more difficult than it already is to stop global warming beyond 1.5 degrees centigrade. Australia must immediately stop investing in new fossil fuel projects. While this may be a difficult transition to accept given the enormous scope of gas reserves in Australia, there's no point spending vast amounts of money on new infrastructure to extract a resource that will be commercially unviable in a decade. Australia is ignoring the economic and environmental imperatives of transitioning to a low-carbon framework. This is reckless and unfair to other countries. We have the resource capacity and economic strength to transition our energy sector, unlike many developing countries, but we choose not to. John Kerry, the US Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, says the next round of international climate talks in Scotland is the last best chance the world has to avoid a climate crisis. But Australia's investment in new gas development stands in stark contrast to the increasingly ambitious energy commitments of other developed countries. We shouldn't come empty-handed with no new targets to yet another international climate summit. US President Joe Biden has vowed to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 50 to 52% compared to 2005 levels, and he's banned new oil and gas leases on federal land, removed fossil fuel subsidies, and plans to double wind capacity by 2030. Likewise, the European Commission seeks to stop funding oil and gas projects. Denmark recently implemented a ban on future gas extraction in the North Sea, and Spain has done the same. Australia is ignoring its global responsibilities. As a result, will be hit hard by the so-called carbon border adjustment policies from the US and the European Union, which taxes imported goods according to their carbon footprint. Ultimately, our actions will leave us economically and environmentally isolated in a rapidly emerging new energy world order. Well, there are some very concerning comments there, which I have to say ring true to me in the light of that recent report. But I'll be coming back to this topic again in the next few days because there are many other perspectives to explore about net zero, climate change, on all those other issues. But they're issues we have to talk about rather than just sweep away under the carpet. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.